You are sitting in a hospital waiting room you have never visited. You do not know this yet, but stay with me for a moment. A study published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology tracked two populations with something unusual in common. Both were diagnosed with certain hematological cancers at roughly the same stage. One group had inflammatory biomarkers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6 fibrinogen, running so clean they could have been used as control subjects in a wellness trial. The other group had chronic systemic inflammation, years of it, the kind that shows up on a blood panel and makes a physician pause before speaking. Same cancer, same stage, 5-year progression rates, statistically identical. The researchers noted this carefully. They did not sensationalize it. They wrote, in the measured language scientists use when they do not yet understand what they are looking at, that the protective effect of low baseline inflammation did not translate to the expected survival advantage in this particular cancer subtype. They flagged it for follow-up. They moved on, but that sentence has been sitting in the back of certain minds ever since. There's a specific smell to old hospital linoleum. Faintly chemical, faintly sweet. The kind that makes the air feel thinner than it is, makes your shoulders drop without your permission, makes you aware of your own breathing in a way you usually are not. That smell is what this finding produces when you follow it to its end. Because here is what it implies. A person who spent the last decade measuring their sleep cycles, calibrating their protein intake, pulling blood every 90 days to watch their inflammatory markers fall, and a person who did none of that, who ate badly, moved rarely, carried decades of unresolved tension in their body the way old furniture accumulates in a room no one cleans. Both arrived at the same biological checkpoint. The cancer did not distinguish between them, did not register the discipline, did not reward the sacrifice. If the optimized body and the neglected body arrive at the same place, what exactly is the optimization protecting? Not a rhetorical question, a genuine one. The kind that researchers and clinicians working in hematological oncology have not yet been able to fully answer, and the kind that tends to make people in the biohacking world go quiet in a way they are not used to going quiet. Now, the data is not saying optimization is worthless. It is saying something more specific than that, more uncomfortable, more interesting. There is a moment, and if you have been in it, you know exactly what I mean, where you're sitting in a waiting room or reading something on your phone at 6 in the morning, and a sentence lands in a way that does not feel informational. It feels personal, like it was written about you, or for you, or maybe just a little bit at you. That is where this chapter starts. Not with the headline, with the feeling the headline leaves behind. Because earlier this year, 2 publications reported the same story. NJ.com, the kind of regional outlet that writes things plainly because it does not have time or budget for softening, reported that a prominent biohacker had been diagnosed with a medical condition classified as incurable. Not managed, not in remission, incurable. The Independent picked it up internationally and used the same word, and the word just sat there in the middle of the sentence. Heavy, still, incurable. No name matters here. What matters is the category of person. This was not someone who had ignored the signals, not someone who had eaten badly, slept 4 hours, and hoped genetics would cover the gap. This was someone who had built their entire existence around the optimization of their own biology, tracked everything, measured everything, adjusted, published, refined, repeated. The kind of person for whom the body is not just a vehicle. Scores, the content, the community, the sense of being someone who has figured it out, is that because to say longevity is not about perfection inside a world that has commercially and personally committed to perfection as the organizing principle. That is not a small thing. That is someone touching the live wire and telling the truth about what it felt like. And the field largely looked away. That choice is worth something. When one of their own received a diagnosis that no protocol prevented, the most public response was not to examine the framework. It was to footnote it, to say, we never actually promised perfection, even as perfection was the entire architecture. The scores, the supplements, the content, the identity, the implicit promise that you could become someone to whom decline happened less. So if you are sitting with that crack, the one this story opened up, I want you to hear this clearly. The crack is not the problem. The crack is information. It is the gap between the frequency you were told would protect you and the frequency that actually builds a life you can inhabit without fear. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're standing at the edge of a more honest conversation about what health actually is and what it is actually for. That is not a smaller place to stand. That is a larger one. And the path from here is not about optimizing harder. It is about understanding what you are actually building and what it is you actually want to feel. Nobody hands you the moment. You don't see it coming, and you don't get to rehearse it. One day, the abstraction, getting older, the body's slow arithmetic, stops being abstract. A number arrives. A face changes across a desk. You're standing at a graveside in November, breath visible, doing the math on the gap between your age and his, and the answer is closer than you expected. The abstraction lands. And once it lands, you move. You buy the continuous glucose monitor. You restructure sleep around circadian data. You learn to pronounce phosphatidylserine. You start logging recovery scores the way your father logged bowling averages, consistently, without apology, because the number means something. You build a system, not a trend, not a phase. A system, the way you'd build anything you intend to last, with your hands, with patience, tested underweight. The longevity world responded to the diagnosis from Chapter 2, The Way Cold Moves Through Old Plumbing. Invisible until the pipes show it. Experts who'd spent careers measuring biological age started choosing words with the precision of attorneys. Not because the science had failed them, because the story beneath the science, the one insisting that optimization could outrun anything, that the protocol was the answer to every question the body might eventually ask, that story felt suddenly thin. And when a story feels thin, people grip it tighter. They clean up the language. They cite better studies. They don't concede anything they don't have to concede. The fear of limits ran through every sentence, and you had to listen for it the way you listen for a knock in an engine. Not the sound itself, but what the sound means. They weren't the only ones holding on. The smell of pine shavings and motor oil is the first thing in the morning in David Ortega's garage. 53, former high school football coach from Tucson, has done his morning lifts out here since 2019, back when he never heard the word biohacking. Started with a pull-up bar, a few books, a podcast recommendation from a colleague who'd read about heat shock proteins. Now there are blood panels taped to the corkboard beside the workbench. Quarterly results going back 4 years. Red pen, where he improved. Blue circle, where he still wants to. The paper is starting to curl at the corners from the desert heat. He tracks sleep latency. Zone 2 cardio 4 days a week, because a study out of the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute convinced him that mitochondrial density was worth protecting before it became a problem. He doesn't talk about any of this at family dinners, just does it the way serious people do serious things quietly while everyone else is still deciding whether to start. David is not unusual. He is a type. Once you see the type, you see it everywhere. Claudine is 51, lives in Portland, and every morning she steps outside before her glasses are on, before the coffee is finished, before the neighborhood is awake. The air still smells of last night's rain on concrete. She does this because her mother's diagnosis, early onset cognitive decline, diagnosed at 62, was the kind of thing you watch and then cannot unwatch. Stood in that hospital hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the squeak of rubber saw somewhere down the corridor, and made the decision at 47 that the only rational response was to act before there was anything to respond to. What she restructured wasn't just her morning. It was her orientation toward time. The research from the Salk Institute on circadian entrainment and suprachiasmatic signaling gave her the framework. Her mother's face gave her the reason. The accountant in Charlotte fasts 16 hours a day, not because he read something fashionable, but because a 2021 paper in Cell Reports Medicine laid out specific metabolic benefits in adults over 45 in language he found credible enough to test on himself. He uses a continuous ketone monitor. He logs everything in a spreadsheet, rows color-coded, going back 2 years. His resting heart rate dropped 11 beats. His A1C normalized. He keeps the printouts in a folder. He can show you. He's the kind of man who likes to show you, not to impress, but because the numbers are the proof that the decision was right, and he needs that proof nearby. These are not eccentric people. They are not tech billionaires. They are people who absorb a loss early enough to take it seriously and late enough to believe they could still change the outcome. What they share is not income or zip code or political temperament. What they share is a specific gravity, the weight of a moment when getting older became a concrete threat, and the only response that felt honest was action. That moment came from somewhere specific. From watching a parent lose the thread mid-sentence at dinner, fork still in hand. From a doctor's face that changed for just a second before it composed itself again, and you saw the change and you understood what it meant. From catching your own posture in a bathroom mirror, the particular forward lean of it, the way the shoulders have begun to settle, and recognizing it as your father's. These are not neurotic motivations. They're human ones. The kind that will make a person drive 40 minutes to a lab for a quarterly blood panel insurance won't touch, because waiting, not knowing, trusting the annual physical to catch what it almost never catches. That feels like a bet you've already decided you won't make. The science behind what these people do is, in large part, real. A 2022 analysis from the University of Copenhagen found that consistent aerobic exercise in adults over 45 produced measurable reductions in biological age markers across multiple tissue types. Not modestly, measurably. The research on time-restricted eating, on specific strength thresholds, on sleep architecture, and amyloid clearance. These are peer-reviewed, replicated, increasingly refined. The people who've built their lives around this work are not delusional. They are responding to real information with real discipline. But here is what Robert Sapolsky found across 30 years of watching stress operate in baboons and humans alike. The expectation of control is not the same as control itself. The belief that behavior reliably shapes outcome is biologically active. It changes hormonal environment, immune function, cellular repair. The belief does real work. But the version that becomes a guarantee, that says if I do everything right, the body will comply, that version carries its own particular weight. And the body, Sapolsky kept finding, registers the difference between the two. It registers the difference between a man who runs because he loves the feeling of his lungs working and a man who runs because he is afraid of what stops running might mean. David in his garage with the curl-edge panels on the corkboard. Claudine on the wet sidewalk before the glasses go on. The accountant with his folder. None of them are wrong to do what they do. The discipline is real. The motivation runs through something genuine. Love for their own lives, love for the people who depend on them staying. The law of vibration is not separate from this. The frequency you prepare inside yourself, the emotional ground you lay before the crisis arrives, that is not decoration. It is structure. What you build in the body, you build alongside what you prepare in the mind. And the two cannot be fully separated, no matter how clean the spreadsheet looks. But somewhere inside that architecture, There's a question most of them have not sat with yet. Not because they're avoiding it, because the protocol doesn't include it. When the diagnosis comes anyway, not as probability, not as a statistic someone else inhabits, but as a fact with your name attached, what happens to the proof? The blood panels, the cortisol timing, the 11-beat drop in resting heart rate, the quiet discipline of a Tuesday morning when every easier option was available and you chose this. What does all of that mean then? That question has a different weight than the ones that built the system. It's worth standing in it for a moment, not moving through it, standing in it the way you'd stand in cold water until your body adjusts and you can feel what's actually there. There is a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up, and by the time you notice, it has already settled into the room. It is the grief of a version of yourself you believed you had locked in, protected, earned. When the identity of someone who does not get sick fractures, what breaks isn't just the news. What breaks is the architecture of a life built around a certainty that no longer holds. Here is something concrete first. A 61-year-old structural engineer. Portland, Oregon. Not a billionaire, not a wellness influencer, not selling anything. We'll use the name Richard, a composite drawn from documented clinical case material in chronic illness psychology research, because the pattern he represents appears with remarkable consistency across thousands of patients. His story is constructed to reflect that pattern accurately. It is not presented as a single real individual. Richard decided 11 years ago to take his health seriously in a way most people never do. He overhauled his diet, cut alcohol entirely. He began training in Zone 2 cardio before the neighborhood woke up, the dawn air still sharp and smelling faintly of pine bark and wet asphalt. He wore a continuous glucose monitor for 14 months straight. He tracked HRV scores the way other men track sports statistics. He wasn't obsessed in a chaotic way. He was methodical, calm, almost scientific. He told his wife, quietly, over dinner one March evening, that he genuinely believed he had removed heart disease from his personal equation. Not reduced the odds, removed it. 14 months later, a scan caught something. Arterial calcification. Early stage, manageable but real. Undeniable. Already there, inside the body, he had measured and monitored and believed he understood. He told a close friend, it felt less like a medical diagnosis and more like finding out someone had been living in my house. That sentence, sit in it, because what Richard's pattern describes isn't unusual. Clinical psychologists working in chronic illness have documented this experience across thousands of patients. A specific flavor of identity disintegration that doesn't have a clean name in everyday language. It isn't just fear of death. It isn't even fear of suffering. It is something more fundamental. The sudden unmooring of a self that was organized entirely around a belief system about the body. When you have spent years constructing the narrative, I am someone who does not get sick, not as wishful thinking, but as a daily practice backed by data, by discipline, by genuine sacrifice, that narrative becomes structural. It holds up parts of how you relate to your work, to your relationships, to the passage of time itself. It becomes a lens. And when the lens shatters, everything that was filtered through it becomes suddenly blurry and strange. This is what clinical psychologists mean when they speak of illness as an ontological assault. The disease doesn't just change the future. It reaches backward and contaminates the past. The years of effort don't disappear, but they no longer mean what they meant. They meant, I am safe. And now they don't mean that anymore. There's a cold clarity to that feeling, a particularly lonely kind of exposure. And here is where the biohacking culture, the quantified self-movement, the wearables, the 5-panel blood work, the meticulous supplementation schedules, faces something it was never fully designed to metabolize. Not failure of the protocol, but failure of the identity the protocol was carrying. Because here is what the research shows, and it is uncomfortable in a way that matters. The more control-oriented the approach to health, the more the brain begins to encode identity and safety as synonymous with biological performance. Studies examining psychological response to diagnosis in high health investment populations have pointed to something specific. High-control health identifiers show not just greater psychological distress at diagnosis, but a measurably longer delay in adaptive coping. The belief in control doesn't just cushion the blow less. It actively slows the recovery of psychological equilibrium. The discipline that protected the body had also, quietly, made the mind more brittle. There's a kind of irony in that which demands honesty. You cannot measure your way out of mortality. You can shift timelines, you can build real resilience, you can profoundly improve both the length and quality of your life. And all of that is worth doing, worth continuing. But the act of measuring cannot be allowed to become the act of believing you are exempt. Because exempt is a word the body doesn't recognize. The smell of hospital antiseptic is not something you prepare for with a heart rate variability protocol. The moment when your doctor pauses before speaking, that half second of silence in a room where the ventilation system hums low and steady. No supplement stack blunts the edge of that. It lands, and it lands differently when you believed you had made impossible. Richard said something else to that same friend weeks later. He said, "The strangest part is that nothing in my blood panel suggested this was coming. I was monitoring everything, and it was already there. That is not a story about failure. It is a story about the limits of what can be seen from outside." Which brings us to a place the longevity conversation rarely goes, and where it needs to go now. There is an older framework, one that predates blood work panels and wearable sensors by centuries, which holds that the physical body doesn't operate in isolation from the energetic and emotional states that move through it. The law of vibration proposes that everything, including biological tissue, including the interior states we carry without measuring, exists in a state of frequency. And the law of attraction, its operational extension, suggests that the dominant internal states we hold draw toward us and shape within us conditions that match their character. These aren't fringe ideas dressed up in metaphysics. They surface in modified language, inside psychoneuroimmunology research, inside the study of chronic stress and inflammatory markers, inside the growing literature on how emotional architecture alters gene expression over time. The framework matters here not as a replacement for longevity science, but as its missing interior layer. Because what Richard was monitoring was the outside of the system. What he wasn't measuring, what no morning protocol currently measures, was the interior frequency he was living from. The chronic low hum of vigilance. The identity organized entirely around threat management. The emotional state that discipline, paradoxically, can lock in place. The longevity science of the last 2 decades has been extraordinary in what it's mapped. Biomarkers, methylation patterns, cellular senescence, mitochondrial efficiency. The tools are real. The gains are documented. But there is an interior landscape operating below any blood work panel currently available that science has not yet fully charted. And it may be the variable that matters most. There is a number that should have ended the argument: 91%. That is the sensitivity rate reported in a 2021 Memorial Sloan Kettering study on multi-analyte blood panels. The kind of panel that scans for dozens of cancer-related proteins, inflammatory markers, methylation signals, clotting factors, immune cell ratios. 91% sensitivity for certain tumor types. That is not a modest claim. That is a landmark number. The kind of number that gets presented at oncology conferences in rooms with bad coffee and fluorescent lighting that hums just slightly too loud, and every physician in the room goes quiet for a second before the questions start. 91%. Here is what that number does not mean. It does not mean that if you run the panel and it comes back clean, you are clean. It does not mean that what is forming in your body right now, if anything will be visible tomorrow or next month or next year. And it does not mean that the 9% who fall outside the detection window are rare edge cases. In some hematological conditions, in some autoimmune trigger pathologies, that 9% is exactly where the cases begin that no one sees coming. The science didn't fail. It simply never promised what a lot of people assumed it was promising. That is the distinction that changes everything about how the rest of this lands. There's a specific kind of faith that develops in people who commit seriously to longevity optimization. It is not naive faith. It is data-supported faith, which makes it harder to shake and in some ways more brittle when it finally meets the edge of what the data can actually see. The faith goes something like this: if I measure enough, often enough, with enough precision, I will know. I will catch what is coming before it arrives. The body becomes a signal, and I become fluent in its language. That is not a foolish belief. The research supports significant portions of it. A 2022 Johns Hopkins Medicine review of predictive biomarker panels found that comprehensive longitudinal blood monitoring, tracking the same individual over time rather than comparing against a population average, improved early detection windows across several inflammatory and metabolic conditions by a meaningful margin. Not catching everything, catching more, earlier. That matters. It saves lives. But the same review noted something that tends not to make it into the press release. Certain hematological conditions, a category that includes specific lymphomas, rare autoimmune-mediated blood disorders, and some myeloproliferative diseases, showed what the researchers called preclinical invisibility windows. Periods where the pathology is actively developing at the cellular level but produces no detectable signal in even the most comprehensive panel. Not a faint signal. No signal. You sit in the chair. The technician wraps the elastic band around your arm, taps for the vein, draws 4 vials in 2 minutes. You press the cotton ball to the puncture site on the drive home. 7 days later, the portal updates, and every marker sits inside its colored band. You feel the shoulders drop. You feel the day lighten. And the thing that may or may not be forming keeps forming, indifferent to what the portal says. This is not a criticism of the science. That needs to be said plainly, without hedging. The science of longevity biomarkers is one of the most important areas of medicine being developed right now. The ability to detect risk years before symptoms emerge. To intervene when intervention is still elegant rather than brutal is genuinely transformational. Researchers at institutions like Memorial Sloan Kettering and Johns Hopkins are doing work that will change how millions of people experience aging. That is real. That is worth saying out loud. But there is a difference between what the science can do and what the broader wellness and longevity industry tells people the science can do. And that gap, that quiet space between what is true and what is sold, is where a certain kind of psychological vulnerability takes root. You run the panel. Everything comes back within range. And somewhere beneath the relief, a belief solidifies. I have done the work. I am protected. The numbers say I'm safe. The numbers say you are currently within detected parameters. Those are not the same sentence. A research team at the University of Pittsburgh published findings in 2023 examining the triggering mechanisms behind a cluster of autoimmune-mediated blood conditions, disorders where the immune system, for reasons still not fully mapped, begins attacking its own cells. What they found was not a single genetic marker, not a detectable protein in advance of the attack. What they found was a category of triggers they described as environmental and psychoneuroimmunological, meaning the interface between immune system behavior and nervous system state, as mediated by chronic stress signaling. They were not speculating. They were reporting measured findings. The immune dysregulation in these cases was not caused by a pathogen, not caused by a genetic defect detectable in advance, not caused by poor nutrition or a lack of exercise. It appeared to be modulated, not created, but modulated by the sustained presence of biological stress chemistry. Cortisol, yes, but also cytokine cascades, sympathetic nervous system dominance, inflammatory signaling loops that ran quietly in the background for years before anything clinically visible occurred. There is no panel for that. No blood draw captures the cumulative cost of what a person carries internally. The low-grade alarm state that never fully shuts off, the vigilance that was useful once and became structural. Those are not biomarkers. They are not measurable by anything currently in clinical use. And they are not nothing. The irony, and this is worth sitting with, is that some of the conditions least visible to advanced diagnostics are among those most influenced by the very internal environment that optimization culture tends to ignore. You can optimize sleep architecture. You can optimize your VO2 max. You can track HRV every morning before you leave the bed, watching the number climb or drop the way you used to watch your resting heart rate after a hard training block, patiently, over weeks, waiting for the trend to tell you something true. And all of that is useful, genuinely. But the question of what you are carrying inside, the emotional weight, the unfinished threat responses, the identity built around not being sick, the anxiety that runs just below consciousness like a machine left on overnight, that does not show up in a panel. It shows up later, in other ways. The smell of the hospital waiting room, antiseptic and something warmer underneath, like recycled air that has held too many heavy conversations. That smell is not in anyone's preventive protocol. But for a lot of people, that room is where they find out that the numbers were fine right up until the numbers weren't. What the best researchers in predictive medicine will tell you, if you ask them honestly, is this: Panels measure what is already present. They do not measure what is becoming. And the gap between those two states, between what can be detected and what is already in motion, is where the limits of optimization currently lie. That is not a tragedy. It is a fact, and a fact received clearly, without panic and without denial, is far more useful than a belief that was never quite true. Which brings everything to a single question: whether there is a category of risk that lives entirely outside what any panel of blood can see. Not genetic, not inflammatory, not metabolic, something that no laboratory currently screens for. Not because the technology doesn't exist, but because the framework for understanding it hasn't been taken seriously enough, long enough by the right people. The research that exists on this is older than most people assume, and stranger than the longevity industry would find comfortable to sell. It involves the relationship between what a person believes about their own body, what they expect, what they fear, and the measurable biological changes those internal states produce at the cellular level. That is where this lands now. Not as a tease, as the thing itself. The numbers came back clean. That's the part that stays with you. Not the diagnosis, not the treatment protocol. The fact that the numbers came back clean and something was still wrong. Most men don't talk about that gap. They file it somewhere. They order another test, add another marker to the panel, assume the answer is in the next layer of data. And because the system rewards that impulse, because there is always another layer, the filing never quite finishes. Here's what I want to sit with for a moment. Before any research enters this room, think about what it actually feels like to wake up and check your metrics before your feet hit the floor. Not what it achieves. What it feels like. The small, involuntary scan that happens before the number even loads. The quarter second where you're already braced. The way a dip in HRV lands differently than a rise. The way you carry the morning red into the first hour of the day, quietly cross-referencing it against how you slept, what you ate, whether that number explains something you felt in your chest at 2 in the morning. That's not a habit. That's a posture. And the body knows the difference between the two. A 2019 paper in Psychosomatic Medicine tracked adults engaged in what the researchers called health-vigilant behavior. Not sick people, not anxious people in any clinical sense, but conscientious, informed, genuinely responsible self-monitors doing exactly what the biohacking literature recommends. Wearables logged, HRV cross-referenced, meals tracked against inflammatory indexes, symptoms interpreted as data requiring response. What the researchers measured was allostatic load, a composite marker of long-term biological wear drawn from stress hormones, inflammatory proteins, immune response, cardiovascular strain. It doesn't show up on a standard panel. You have to go looking for it specifically. The subjects with the highest health-vigilant behavior showed allostatic load profiles comparable to people managing moderate chronic stress disorders. Not from illness, from protection. And then the University of Pittsburgh's Brain, Behavior, and Immunity Lab documented what they called the defensive preparation cascade, a sustained metabolic and immune state produced by chronic watchfulness. The brain, operating well below conscious intention, processes sustained vigilance as evidence that vigilance is necessary. Vigilance is necessary when danger is present. So the system concludes, not irrationally, that danger must be present, and it prepares accordingly. Month after month, year after year, The Tilburg Department of Health Psychology tracked it in the blood work directly. Individuals high in what they termed somatic vigilance, the ongoing interpretation of bodily sensation as potential threat, showed significantly elevated interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein over 18 months, independent of any actual health events. No injury, no infection. The inflammation was responding to the anticipatory scanning for injury and infection. The body inflaming to prepare for a wound that hadn't arrived. Now, the body doesn't distinguish cleanly between the threat you're watching for and the act of watching for it. That's not a metaphor. That's the mechanism. The nervous system reads sustained watchfulness as confirmation that something requiring watching is present, and so it stays ready. And staying ready, at that level of biological cost, produces the exact internal environment. Chronic low-grade inflammation, elevated stress hormones, compressed immune variability that motivates the monitoring in the first place. This is where two things need to be named directly, because they're operating in the background of everything we've covered, and they don't get named enough in this conversation. The first is what's sometimes called the law of vibration, the principle that the internal state you sustain over time is not incidental to your outcomes. It is the terrain in which your outcomes are grown. Your cells aren't responding to your intentions. They're responding to your actual sustained internal frequency. A body held in chronic low-grade alert is a body bathed in the chemistry of alert, regardless of how sophisticated the protocol surrounding it is. The second is the law of attraction, understood not as mysticism, but as the biological and behavioral reality that the system you're running tends to generate evidence that confirms itself. A man monitoring for threat will find threat in ambiguous data, in mild symptoms, in deviations from baseline, because that's what the tune system is calibrated to surface. The monitoring creates the stress chemistry. The stress chemistry creates real physiological changes. The real physiological changes justify more monitoring, and the loop tightens. These two laws together aren't an argument against care. They're a map of what happens when care is running on the wrong fuel. There's a difference between a body that is cared for and a body that is watched, between a body that is trusted and a body that is audited. I know that sounds like the kind of distinction that belongs in a different kind of conversation, softer, less rigorous. But the biochemistry doesn't make that concession. The tissue doesn't care what you call it. It responds to the internal environment it's actually living in, which means the most important question isn't what your next panel will show. It's what frequency you're running the whole operation from. A man could do everything right: the sleep, the inputs, the tracking, the quarterly bloods, the inflammatory markers, the HRV baseline, and still be at the level where it actually counts, in a sustained state of biological siege. Not because his protocol is wrong, because the state he's managing it from is generating its own chemistry underneath all of it. That's the layer no panel is designed to reach. So here's where this lands, practically, for a man sitting with this right now. The first move isn't to stop monitoring. It's to notice what you feel in the moment after you check. Informed or quietly, persistently afraid. Because those two states have completely different biochemical signatures, and only one of them creates the internal terrain where the work you're doing actually lands the way you intend it to. The second move is to understand that the internal environment is not a side effect of your health practice. It is the practice. The Last Tuesday, a story ran in The Guardian that most people scroll past. Researchers at UCSF published findings showing that men in their 50s who scored highest on what the team called health vigilance, consistent self-monitoring, frequent symptom checking, sustained engagement with personal biomarker tracking, had inflammatory profiles that looked older than their chronological age. Not younger, older. The effect was independent of diet, exercise, sleep duration, and supplement use. It held even in the men who were doing everything right by every other metric. The researchers were careful in how they worded it. Scientists usually are, but what they were describing underneath the careful wording was something that lands differently once you've spent any real time thinking about it. The act of watching yourself for signs of decline can produce the biology of decline. Not symbolically, in the blood. There's a morning feeling you probably know. Not quite anxiety, more like the low hum of a machine that never fully powers down. The sense that something needs to be checked, tracked, confirmed before the day can begin. The glucose monitor read. The HRV score noted. The sleep stages reviewed. That feeling is not weakness. It is intelligence applied to a real problem. Bodies do change after 45, the data is real, and the instinct to pay attention is sound. The UCSF study does not say the instinct is wrong. What it says is something more uncomfortable than that. Robert Sapolsky spent decades watching stress work from the inside out. And one of the cleaner things he documented was the physiological difference between acute threat and sustained anticipation of threat. They feel similar from the inside. They are not the same in the body. Acute fear, real, present, physical, spikes cortisol, mobilizes the immune system, then closes. The zebra shakes after the lion passes. Literally shakes, a full body tremor, and then grazes again. The event ends. The biology follows. The mean it. The physiological signature was closer to settled. Status resolved, not won, not proved, but resolved. Resting heart rate lower. Slow shouting is more concrete and more available than the framing around biohacking usually suggests. That is where this lands next. There's a question that has been building since the early segments of this video, and it has waited long enough. If the research points toward chronic vigilance, self-monitoring driven by fear, the body held under continuous threat assessment, producing measurable downstream damage, then what does a reasonable person do with that? Stop the blood work? Cancel the gym? Put the sleep tracker in a drawer and let the body do whatever it's going to do? That's where the mind goes first. And it's not irrational that it goes there. The moment someone hears that fear-based health optimization can corrode the systems it's trying to protect, something very human happens. The options collapse into two. Either I do all of this, or I do none of it. Either I fight for my body, or I give it up. Watch what that framing costs, because neither of those options is the actual question. There's a study from the University of Pittsburgh, published in Psychosomatic Medicine, before longevity became an industry with its own conference circuit, that tracked two groups of cardiac rehabilitation patients through an identical 12-week program. Same exercises, same duration, same clinical staff, same dietary guidance handed to both groups on the same laminated sheets. The rehab gym had a specific smell: rubber flooring, recycled air, the faint metallic edge of whatever cleaner they used on the equipment. Both groups walked in through the same door and breathed that same air. Both groups sweated under fluorescent panels while their heart rates were logged by the same technicians. The inputs were identical. At the end of 12 weeks, the group with significantly better cardiac output, lower resting inflammatory markers, and stronger heart rate variability was not the group that pushed harder. It was the group whose self-reported reason for being there was described in the study's language as care rather than correction. Not a spiritual category, a clinical one, documented in the data. The patients who arrived with an internal frame of something is wrong with me and I need to fix it showed slower biological improvement than patients who understood the same activity as maintaining something already worth preserving. One group was tending, the other was warring. The treadmill didn't know the difference. The body did. What that looks like from the inside, though, that's where it gets harder. The second objection is sharper, and it's worth sitting with rather than brushing past. Isn't care from trust instead of fear just another performance layer? Now the task isn't only to do the workout, it's to feel correctly while doing it, to cultivate some specific inner quality along with the reps. That's a legitimate concern, because you can't decide your way into trust the same way you decide to take a different route home. Someone who has spent 40 or 50 years with a quiet background sense that the body is unreliable, that aging is something happening to them, that every new symptom is a small betrayal, that accumulated orientation doesn't shift because an argument landed well. And here's the part that makes it genuinely difficult. Chronic threat orientation doesn't tend to feel like fear from the inside. It presents as diligence. It looks like discipline. The person monitoring their glucose for the third time on a Thursday afternoon, the one cross-referencing their VO2 max against actuarial tables at 11 at night. They're not experiencing themselves as anxious. They're experiencing themselves as responsible. The state is invisible to the person inside it, which is precisely what makes it persistent. The researchers at the University of Rochester, who spent decades building what they called self-determination theory of health behavior, found something that lands directly here. They distinguished between two modes of motivation. Controlled. I do this because I'm afraid of what happens if I stop, because the guilt or the panic, or the imagined consequence is worse than the effort. Autonomous. I do this because it makes sense to me, because I understand what it's for, because it connects to something I actually value rather than something I'm trying to outrun. Across multiple studies, autonomous motivation produced better long-term adherence and better biological outcomes. And one specific finding: lower cortisol reactivity during the health behaviors themselves. The nervous system's stress response was measurably quieter during exercise when the person was there by genuine choice rather than compulsion. You're somewhere before the alarm goes off. Not asleep, not quite awake. Somewhere in between, in that narrow band where the body has not yet received its instructions for the day. The chest is still. The jaw is unclenched. The breath moves without anyone managing it. That state lasts, for most people, about 40 seconds after consciousness returns. Then the architecture of the day assembles itself. The thing that needs to happen, the thing that might go wrong, the thing that was left unresolved yesterday, and the body quietly shifts into a posture it will hold for the next 16 hours without anyone noticing, without anything on the wearable flagging it, without a single blood panel catching it. A low-grade readiness. A background hum of not quite safe. This is where the conversation that has been building across the last several chapters actually lives. Not in the supplements, not in the training protocol. Here, in what the body is doing before it does anything else. There is a particular kind of man who shows up repeatedly in the research literature on midlife health optimization. so consistently that the profile has started to feel almost archetypal. He wakes at a consistent hour. He tracks HRV. He has calibrated his omega-3 ratio, takes magnesium glycinate at the correct time relative to sleep onset, lifts with intention, and has largely eliminated alcohol. His last longevity panel came back with numbers his physician described, without irony, as impressive for his age. And underneath all of it, running beneath the discipline like a current beneath a river's surface, is fear. Not clinical anxiety, nothing that would register on a screening questionnaire, just a tightness behind every decision, a flavor of dread threaded through the effort, fear that the next scan will find something the last one missed, fear that a week off the protocol will cost him at the cellular level in ways he cannot yet measure but suspects are real, fear that the entire carefully assembled structure might, despite everything, not be enough. He is doing the work. That is not in question. The question is what environment that work is being performed inside. A team at the University of Constance published findings in Psychophysiology in 2018 that were not about aging, not about supplementation, not about any of the things that draw attention in longevity circles. They were studying what they called chronic preparedness arousal. Not anxiety disorder, not acute stress, just the baseline state of sustained readiness in otherwise healthy adults. At rest, in quiet rooms, between events. People who scored high on this measure showed suppression of natural killer cell activity. Not during a crisis, not following a trauma. At baseline, the immune system was reading a signal that the blood panel was not showing, and it was responding to that signal the way it responds to threats by deploying resources, contracting its availability, bracing. Work out of the Institute of Biomedical Science at the University of Sao Paulo in 2021 added something to this. Examining heart rate variability as a predictive marker for immune competence across aging populations. The researchers found that the coherence of the rhythmic conversation between heart and brain, not any single biomarker, not age alone, predicted immune response with unusual reliability. Not what the body was doing, how the body was relating to itself. And researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology, examining neuroimmune consequences of sustained defensive orientation in midlife adults, found that the autonomic nervous system in chronic low-level threat activation dysregulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in ways that no antioxidant stack corrects, no cold exposure reverses, no sleep hygiene protocol fully compensates for. The interference sits upstream of all of it. The vigilant body is braced. The braced body does not repair. The body that does not repair ages faster than its chronological age, and the supplements arrive downstream of that arithmetic, not upstream. There's a word that tends to arrive packaged in a kind of spiritual foam padding, vibration. Stripped of that packaging, what it is actually describing is a chronic internal state, the default orientation of the nervous system, the posture the organism holds moment to moment in relation to its environment. Not mood, not emotion, something more stubborn and more biological than either, something that runs continuously beneath conscious intention and cannot be corrected by adding another variable to the protocol. A man can track every measurable output of his physiology and miss this entirely. The wearable does not track it. The panel does not catch it. Morning air, through a cracked window, cold enough to tighten the lungs. That sharpness is useful for seconds. Across years, it is corrosive. The body was not designed to hold that edge indefinitely. And when it tries, it pays in the currency of cellular repair. What some frameworks call the law of attraction is, at a biological level, simply a description of what happens when a body lives in sustained resistance to threat. It consistently recruits the outcomes it is organized to prevent, not through any mechanism that requires belief, through immunology, through the sustained suppression of repair systems that can only fully activate when the organism, below cognition, below intention, below whatever the protocol says, registers the environment as safe enough to heal. This is not an argument against discipline. The man tracking his HRV and lifting with precision is not wrong to do those things. The argument is about the origin of the effort. The same behavior, performed from a state of trust versus a state of fear, produces measurably different downstream biology. The wellness industry has no particular interest in saying this clearly, because trust cannot be sold and fear is an extraordinary engine for subscription revenue. But the data does not share that interest. So the question this section of the video has been building toward is not philosophical. It is not about reframing or perspective or attitude. It is whether changing the chronic internal state, not believing differently about it, not thinking more positively, but actually shifting the biological baseline produces different cellular outcomes. In real people, over real time, with measurements that survive scrutiny. That question has answers. The next section goes there. You already know the feeling, not the diagnosis itself. Maybe you haven't had that. But the moment when something in your body stops cooperating with the plan, the scan that comes back strange, the number that sits outside the range, the morning when the protocol you've been following with discipline and precision simply doesn't explain what's happening to you. That moment, what you do in that moment, what your nervous system does before you even decide anything, is what this chapter is actually about. Because that moment is where the biohacker was. And it's where most people watching this will be, or have already been, or will be again. A few years ago, a research team at the University of Rochester published something that barely made the science press. They weren't chasing headlines. They had spent years following people managing chronic illness, autoimmune conditions, persistent inflammatory disease, the diagnoses that don't resolve on a schedule and don't respond to willpower. What they wanted to understand was deceptively simple. Among patients with nearly identical clinical profiles, same age, same diagnosis, same treatment protocol, why did some people stabilize and others decline? Not immediately. Over time, slowly, in ways that accumulated. They were not looking for a philosophical answer. They found one anyway. The variable that consistently predicted downstream outcomes, inflammatory markers, immune signaling, cortisol regulation across months, wasn't treatment adherence. It wasn't diet, supplement load, or sleep compliance. It was a psychological posture the researchers called radical acceptance. Not as a soft phrase from a therapy workbook, as something precise and measurable. What they were measuring was this: whether a person had stopped burning metabolic and neurological fuel fighting the fact that something was happening to them. Not whether they'd made peace with it. Not whether they felt fine. Many of the people who scored highest on this variable were still frightened. Some are grieving. but they had stopped running a continuous war against the present moment, against the reality that the thing was real and it was theirs. And the body, when it stopped being conscripted into that war, began doing something different. The inflammatory patterns shifted. Immune response stabilized. Not because the person had given up, because a system that is no longer spending resources on a battle cannot win has resources left over for repair. You've been in a waiting room at some point. Maybe a hospital, maybe a clinic. The ones where the fluorescent lights are slightly too white and the air sits at that temperature just a few degrees below comfortable, the kind that keeps you a little alert whether you want to be or not. People in those rooms go very still. It looks like calm. It isn't, usually. It's the physical posture of someone holding something enormous and refusing to drop it. That holding, just the act of holding without fighting, turns out to be biologically distinct from escalation. Different hormonal cascade, different immune signaling, different gene expression, in ways that researchers at Rochester and earlier at the University of Miami's Behavioral Medicine Research Center spent years mapping in people with HIV, with lupus, with the diagnoses that used to arrive with a simple and devastating prognosis and very little else. Viktor Frankl didn't have the language of cytokine, signaling, or epigenetics. He called meaning the variable that determined survival. The Rochester researchers eventually put numbers around the mechanism he was describing. The biohacker's problem isn't that he didn't optimize hard enough. The problem is that optimization, as a total philosophy, was built without a category for this. There's no dashboard metric for what a person brings to what they cannot change. No tracking protocol for the quality of presence someone maintains when the protocol fails. The entire architecture of maximum control assumes that what cannot be controlled is simply a gap in the system, something to be closed with better data, a newer supplement stack, a more disciplined intervention. What the data from Rochester says, quietly, persistently, in the way that inconvenient findings tend to say things, is that continuous vigilant control is itself metabolically expensive. The person who treats every variance as an emergency, who fights every imperfect number, who never lets the system rest from its own surveillance, that person is running a loud engine. And loud engines burn through parts. This is not an argument against tracking, against optimization, against taking your health seriously. Those tools have real value, and the evidence for many of them is solid. It's an argument about what happens when those tools reach their limit, because they always reach their limit. For every person who has ever lived inside a body, the limit arrives. And what sits beneath the control at that moment, what the person carries into the waiting room, into the diagnosis, into the morning after, is not decoration, is not attitude or mindset in the soft self-help sense. It is the internal environment. It is biological ground. The Rochester researchers didn't discover this because they were looking for Frankl. They discovered it because they were trying to explain a pattern in the numbers that nothing else accounted for. The people who survived better, who stabilized, who showed the downstream biological markers of a system still working. They had learned something the optimization manual doesn't teach. Not resignation, not surrender. Something harder than both of those and more honest. They had stopped spinning themselves on a war with reality. And the energy that freed up went somewhere else. It went into repair. That distinction matters right now. For anyone watching who has had a number come back wrong, a body do something the protocol wasn't supposed to allow, a diagnosis arrived that no dashboard predicted. The culture framed that as failure. The data frames it differently. Radical acceptance, real acceptance, not the kind that's dressed up avoidance, creates the internal environment in which a body has its best available chance to do what it was already built to do. Frankel survived long enough to write the book. The Rochester patients outlived their prognosis. The mechanism connecting those two facts is not mystical. It is measurable. It sits in the hormone cascade and the immune signal and the gene expression pattern of a nervous system that has, at last, been allowed to stop fighting the present moment long enough to attend to the body inside it. That is not a metaphor. That is what the research says. And it is exactly what the man with every biometric optimized and an unexpected diagnosis in his hand had not yet learned how to do. Most people who have taken good care of themselves for a long time have never stopped to ask what was actually powering it. Not as a rhetorical exercise, as a real question, with a real answer that lives somewhere in the chest rather than in the mind's official version of events. How many years of caring for your body have you lived in actual peace? Not the performance of peace, not the calm that sits on top of a low, persistent hum of dread about what the next scan might show, whether the effort has been enough, whether you have been enough. The kind of peace where you move through a morning walk because it feels like something your body wants, not because skipping it feels like a risk you can't afford to take. Think about it in years. Assign a number if you can, and notice what the number does to you. Because a team of researchers at the University of Queensland followed health behavior across years of real life. Not a 6-week trial, not a controlled environment, but ordinary people observed across time with all the inconsistency and noise that comes with it. What they found is not comfortable to sit with. People who maintained exercise, dietary discipline, sleep hygiene, regular monitoring, everything we associate with serious self-care, but who maintained those behaviors primarily from fear of disease, fear of decline, fear of what would happen if they stopped, had measurably worse long-term health outcomes than people doing the same behavior from a different place entirely. From enjoyment, from the felt sense that it made them more themselves, from something that looked from the inside like genuine care rather than damage control. Same behaviors, different fuel, different outcomes. There is no soft way to say what that means. It means a decade of doing everything right can still leave you running the wrong program. It means the effort and the fear powering are not the same thing. And the body is not fooled by discipline when anxiety is the one actually driving. A man on a treadmill at 6 in the morning, the rubber faintly warm under his feet, the gym window still gray with early light. He might be there because his body still feels capable and he loves that feeling. Or he might be there because not being there means facing something he has never looked at directly. From the outside, those two men are identical. The blood panels might be identical for a while. This is where acceptance and resignation stop being philosophical terms and become something you feel in your actual life. To accept a difficult reality, a diagnosis, a limitation, something the body has been telling you, requires honesty not just about what the reality is, but about how you have been relating to it. And most people, when they're genuinely honest, find a ratio is not what they expected. More years of fear, fewer years of love for their own life. The math is uncomfortable, but it is not the end of anything. Work out of the University of Rochester tracking autonomous versus controlled motivation in health behaviors shows the same pattern across different populations. When people engage in self-care because they feel they must, because the alternative is frightening rather than because the behavior itself has meaning, the psychological cost accumulates steadily. The body registers it. Sustained activation of the threat system is not bypassed just because the threat is hypothetical and the response to it looks productive from the outside. You can be disciplined and defended at the same time. And defended is expensive. Research from the University of British Columbia tracking health-conscious adults found something that doesn't get discussed enough. Health vigilance, the constant monitoring, the preemptive worry, the hyper-awareness of physical symptoms, is itself a source of sustained physiological stress in a meaningful subset of people. The monitoring doesn't reduce the anxiety. It feeds it. Each normal reading becomes temporary relief rather than a genuine resting point, because the next test is already scheduled and the fear has quietly found a new target. The question this entire chapter turns on is not whether health practices matter. They do. The question is what has been powering them, because that fuel leaves something behind. And what it leaves behind, accumulated across years, changes the outcome in ways that don't show up until they do. The honest answer to that question does not live in what you tell people about why you take care of yourself. It lives in what you feel in your chest on the mornings when you consider not doing it. That gap between the official explanation and what actually moves through you in that moment is where the truth is. And here is what matters. The act of looking at that gap is not nothing. Research in motivational interviewing shows that the moment a person genuinely examines what has been powering a behavior, something in the behavior shifts. Not always immediately, not dramatically, but the grip on it loosens slightly. A loosened grip is not abandonment. It is the first available space for a different reason to enter. That is the beginning of a real change, not in what you do, but in what is doing it. The smell of coffee that has been on too long. The quiet of a house not yet awake. That is the environment where this question surfaces most honestly. Not in motion, not in a doctor's office, but in the pause before the day's logic takes over and gives you the comfortable answer again. If something in this snagged, if a number came to mind when you try to count the years, and it was not the number you would have chosen, that response is the thing worth following. Not away from health practices, toward them, but from a different starting point. The body that moves because it wants to is not the same body as the one that moves because it is afraid to stop. And you have enough years ahead that the difference is worth understanding now, while there is still time to change what has been in charge. There is a study worth knowing about. Not because it's surprising in the way that makes you forward something to a friend, but because it quietly confirms something you may have already felt without having language for it. The Journal of Behavioral Medicine published findings on what researchers call state-dependent elasticity. The core result is this. The same behavioral input produces measurably different physiological outcomes depending on the autonomic state in which it's performed. Not slightly different. Differently at the level of neuroendocrine regulation, inflammatory signaling, nervous system plasticity. The identical action. Two different internal conditions. Two different biological results. That's not philosophy. That's a replicable, peer-reviewed finding. And if you're over 45 and you've been doing most of the right things for a while now, and still feel like you're working harder than the results justify, that finding is worth sitting with seriously. There is a man in a quiet kitchen in November, early enough that the radiator is still ticking, trying to keep up with the cold that came overnight. He opens the refrigerator, takes out what he always takes out, begins what he always begins. The routine is precise. It has been precise for 2 years. He is consistent in a way that most people who start never manage to stay. And yet something in the way he moves through those first 20 minutes is tight. Not dramatically tight, not visible to anyone watching. The tightness of someone checking a box while scanning for failure. A background audit running underneath every action. The cold glass of water, the way he holds it slightly too firmly, knuckles pale for just a second before releasing. He is doing the right things. He has been doing the right things. But the question driving each action is a version of, what happens if I stop? That question has a texture. It is the texture of defense. And the nervous system, which is not abstract, which is a physical structure embedded in every organ in the body, responds to that texture the same way it responds to any perceived threat. It routes resources accordingly. It deprioritizes repair. It runs hot on vigilance. The protocol is not the problem. The protocol is in fact good. The operating system underneath the protocol is running in a mode the body was designed to use briefly, not chronically. If you recognize that man, it's worth understanding what the research is now able to show with considerably more precision than it could a decade ago. What was once described loosely as stress has been mapped with real resolution. The distinction between sympathetic activation driven by genuine environmental threat and sympathetic activation driven by internally generated narratives of inadequacy and control. That distinction now shows up differently in HRV profiles, in vagal tone measures, in inflammatory cytokine panels. The body knows the difference between running from something and running because you're afraid of what you are without the running. And the state-dependent elasticist work clarifies that plasticity, the nervous system's actual capacity to reorganize, to adapt, to recover, is significantly higher when the baseline state is what researchers call approach orientation. Curiosity, engagement, the internal condition of someone who believes the system is fundamentally working with them, versus avoidance orientation, the internal condition of someone managing a threat. Same inputs, same surface outputs, different biology doing the work underneath. So here is what this is actually offering you, and it is not a new protocol. It is a different question to bring into the one you already have. Not, what if I don't do this right? But, what is my body doing right now that I can be curious about? Not a 5-step reframe, not a fresh start. A single question carried in with the kind of genuine interest you'd bring to something that caught you off guard. The way a strange bird in the yard stops you mid-sentence, and you find yourself actually looking, not performing attention, just looking. That quality of looking is the state. Not manufactured calm, not performed ease, just the momentary replacement of audit with attention. The radiator ticking, the glass in the hand, the cold coming up through the kitchen floor into the bare soles of the feet. That man doesn't need to throw out what he built. He doesn't need a new stack, a different window, a revised version of the routine that took 2 years to make consistent. He needs to change what he's asking while he does it. And this is where the mechanism becomes important, not as comfort, but as something with an actual shape. The autonomic nervous system broadcasts a signal. That signal determines what the body recruits, what it suppresses, what it actually builds toward. A system running in defense builds for emergency. A system running in safety builds for the future. The state you inhabit while you do the work is not incidental to the work. It is part of the biological input. That's the layer most protocols never touch. Because protocols are about behavior, and this is about the condition underneath behavior. Change the condition, not the actions, not the timing, not the supplements, not the sleep window, and the same actions begin producing different results. The research says so. The HRV data says so. And if you're honest with yourself, some part of you already knew something like this was true because you've had mornings where the same routine felt entirely different and you left the kitchen feeling like a different person and you could never quite explain why. The explanation is the state. It was always the state. So the practical question, and this is a practical question, not a philosophical one, because you have a Tuesday morning coming and it will arrive before you're ready, is how you actually carry a different internal condition into something that has become automatic. How do you bring genuine curiosity into a routine built on discipline? How do you change what you're asking without that new question becoming its own form of audit, its own standard to meet or fail? That's not left open because the answer is vague. The answer is specific. It involves something small enough to fit in the first 4 minutes of a morning, before the routine has a chance to calcify around its own momentum. And it works precisely because it doesn't ask you to feel differently. It asks you to notice something before you decide how you feel, which is a different kind of entry point entirely. And it's where this goes next. The question that opened this video, whether a man who optimized everything still couldn't outrun what was already written inside him. That question has been circling every chapter. And here's where it lands. Not as a conclusion, as a recognition. Because what the science kept pointing toward, chapter after chapter, wasn't a missing supplement or a miscalibrated protocol. It was something more uncomfortable than that. The reorientation doesn't require a new protocol. It requires a different question brought to the protocols you already have. The studies out of the Karolinska, the cohort work from Duke, the longitudinal data, tracking people through their 50s and 60s. None of them concluded that the people who aged better had discovered something new. They concluded that those people were asking different things of what they already knew. The posture they brought into the practice changed what the practice could do. That finding has been sitting in the data for decades. Most of what passes for longevity content right now has financial reasons to ignore it because it doesn't convert. You can't put in a stack. You can't run a 30-day challenge on it. The market around aging needs you oriented toward acquisition. The next compound, the next protocol, the next metric that reveals how broken you currently are. That structure works because it keeps the finish line moving. The science, when you follow it past the point where it stops being commercially useful, keeps arriving somewhere else entirely, which is where this channel came in. Not with a purchase link or an inflammation score or a graphic designed to make you feel behind. With the news, the actual event, a study published, a cohort followed for 20 years, a finding that landed quietly in a journal and never made it to the feed because it didn't produce the right emotional response in the reader. What this channel does is take that news seriously, report what it actually says, sit with the weight of it instead of immediately converting it into a recommendation. You're driving somewhere this week, and the radio gives you 40 seconds on a longevity study before cutting to traffic. The anchor reads the headline and moves on. What got cut? The part where the researchers noted that the participants who showed the most favorable outcomes weren't distinguished by what they were doing. They were distinguished by what they believed was possible while they were doing it. That's not the kind of sentence that fits in 40 seconds. It doesn't fit in most longevity videos either, because it redirects attention away from the product and toward the person using it. That sentence is what this channel was built to report. And there's a layer beneath it that the studies gesture toward without fully naming. Something the Karolinska data and the Duke cohort work and the older research into psychophysiological coherence keep approaching from different angles. The findings on intention and outcome, on the measurable relationship between what a person expects and what their biology subsequently does. The researchers who work in this space use careful language around it because the implications are uncomfortable if you follow them to their end. What they're describing in the aggregate is that attention has mass, that the frequency of a sustained mental state isn't a metaphor, that what gets called the law of vibration in older frameworks and what gets called psychoneuroimmunological response in the current literature are not two different things dressed up in different vocabularies. They are the same observation, made by people with different tools, arriving at the same refusal to accept that the inner event and the physical outcome are separate. Most channels in this space have decided that's a third rail. Not because they don't know, because saying it costs something. It costs the clean authority that comes from staying inside the frame that medicine currently sanctions. It costs the part of the audience that needs the content to stay in a register they already recognize. This channel hasn't avoided the cost. So, if you've watched this far, and you have, you weren't here for entertainment. You weren't filling time. You were looking for something that didn't offer easy exits or clean resolutions. Something that reported the weight of the situation honestly and then asked, given all of that, what do you actually do with it? That hunger is specific, and it's worth something. Subscribe if you haven't. Not because there's a transformation promised in the tagline, but because the last chapter takes the thread that's been running underneath every conversation in this video and pulls it the rest of the way through. The researchers who got there first left a record of what they found. It's quieter than the market version, more durable, and it answers the question that opened this whole thing in a way that the protocol and supplement framing was never going to reach. That's where the next video goes. The question was never whether you would get the diagnosis. That is where this ends up. After 14 chapters, after every number and every study and every name and every system designed to push the body past its natural ceiling, that is where the ground is. Not as defeat, as clarity. Let this breathe for a moment. The smell of something cooling. Coffee left on the counter, gone lukewarm now. The small silence of a room after everyone has finally stopped talking, when the air still holds the shape of the conversation. Because we came into this video with a paradox that felt almost cruel, the kind that stops you mid-sentence when you first hear it. A man who had measured everything, optimized everything, slept at the precise temperature and eaten the precise ratio, and tracked his biological age down to the decimal. And the diagnosis arrived anyway. And somewhere in a different house, in a different life, a man who had done none of those things, who had eaten poorly and slept badly, and never once measured his resting heart rate. And he, too, received a diagnosis. Different disease. Same word. Same morning with that paper in hand and the light coming through the window at an angle that suddenly seems wrong. So the question that opened this, what exactly is the optimization protecting? It has been sitting in the background of every chapter. And here is the answer, the full one. It was never protecting against the diagnosis. The body is not a machine you can maintain into immortality. The research is unambiguous on that point, and any honest reading of 2 decades of longevity science says the same thing in different language. The most consistent predictor of disease onset that keeps surfacing across the major longitudinal data sets is not biomarker optimization, not supplementation, not VO2 max. It is something the researchers working in this area call chronic dysregulation of the internal threat response, not the stressor itself, the state from which the body met it. That distinction matters more than almost anything else this video has covered, because what the optimization does, the sleep discipline, the cold exposure, the deliberate stillness, the attention to what you consume and what you allow into the hours before sleep, is not build a wall between you and illness. There is no wall. What it builds is the quality of the interior from which you live, the state you inhabit before the phone rings, the ground you are standing on when the results come back. Pick up the coffee. It has gone cold. There is still something useful in holding it. There is a physiological difference between a body that receives difficult news from a state of chronic low-grade threat and a body that receives that same news from a state of relative internal coherence. The replication work done at the Karolinska on cardiac vagal tone and inflammatory recovery found that the speed and quality of the body's adaptive response to an acute stressor is not primarily determined by the stressor. It is determined by the baseline state of the autonomic nervous system in the hours and days before the stressor arrives. That is the mechanism. That is what the optimization is actually buying you. Not extra years guaranteed. Not immunity to the word incurable. What it is buying, if you're doing it from the right internal place, not from fear, not from a frantic attempt to outrun decay, is a cleaner signal from which to respond. A nervous system that is not already spending all its reserve before the hard thing arrives. A body that can still hear itself when everything outside goes loud. This is the part worth sitting with, and it does not resolve quickly. The state you inhabit before reality makes its demands determines what resources you can actually bring to bear, biological, cognitive, relational. That is not a philosophical claim. That is a sequence. The interior precedes the event. And what follows from that, the quality of the decisions you make in the hardest hours, what you're capable of receiving and acting on, what finds traction and what slides off, all of it runs downstream from that prior condition. The law of vibration, as it gets called in certain traditions, is not mysticism when you're standing in the data. It is a description of order. The frequency from which you're operating when the news lands shapes what the news can do to you and what you can do in return. The room is still quiet. The coffee cup is cold in the hand now. Outside, whatever the day is doing, it is doing it without asking. A man who has trained his interior for 20 years does not necessarily live longer than the man who has not. But he may live the same years more fully inhabited. He may receive the diagnosis from a different ground. He may make different choices in the 72 hours after the word lands. He may sleep the night before the second opinion. He may not, but there is a better chance. And that chance, silent unmeasured by any panel of exams, invisible to the machine that prints the results, may be the only thing that actually separates the two men. We track the external outputs because they are trackable. We measure what the devices can reach. But the interior state, the coherence, or the low-grade chaos from which you are living your days does not show up on a blood panel. It shows up in the texture of the hours, the quality of your attention when someone you love is in the room, the sound of your own breathing in a moment when nothing is asked of you, the way you hold a cup that has already gone cold and do not immediately put it down. That texture is not a luxury, is not a trend. It is the substrate on which the biology runs. So here is where this lands. The question is not whether you are optimizing. The question is what you are optimizing from. Whether the work you're doing on your body is an act of care or an act of fear. Because the body reads the difference, and every serious attempt to separate those two motivations in the data has found the same result. The physiology of fear-based health behavior looks, under the hood, remarkably similar to the physiology of no behavior at all. Same chronic activation, same inflammatory signature. The discipline is there. The internal state it is running on is not. Find one thing this week that you are doing for your body from something other than dread. One thing that is not running away from the diagnosis that might be coming. One thing that is an active presence in the life you are actually living, not a hedge against the one you fear. That is harder than any protocol in this series. And the data across every framework this video has drawn from keeps returning to it as though it cannot help itself. The coffee is cold. The room is still. You already know what the one thing is.